the other is sort of the idea.
And a few more may pop in.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, I guess I'll take over. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this week's installment of the Ask a Yale Environmental Expert webinar series. We're happy to see you all and hope you're all doing well on this beautiful Thursday. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. As always, the webinar is going to start with a 15 to 20 minute presentation from our expert, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with all of you. We encourage you to keep it conversational, so ask your questions directly to our expert. But if you feel more comfortable, you can also type and submit any questions you have either during or after the presentation using the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom window. So this week's topic might be new to many of you, but it's something that's especially near and dear to my heart. I've spent a lot of time over the last few years building bioswales in New Haven. And it's also a little bit different from some of our previous topics. You know, we've been lucky enough to talk to a range of really wonderful experts on topics relating to trees and forests and plants. And even if you remember all the way back to week 1, the relationship between forests and water. But our topic this week is going to focus a bit more on how water behaves and is managed in built environments like downtown New Haven. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest expert for this week, Dr. Gaboury Benoit. Dr. Benoit is the Grinstein Class of 1954 Professor of Environmental Chemistry at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And he is the co-director of the Hickson Center for Urban Ecology, which is the research counterpart to URI. In addition to all of that, Gabe has done a tremendous amount of work trying to understand the impacts and effectiveness of New Haven's bioswale system, and his broader research on chemicals and other pollutants in water has taken him in and out of a pretty large number of New Haven's sewers and storm drains, which I'm sure he'd be happy to elaborate on. So Gabe, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Matt. As Matt pointed out, this is going to be a talk mainly about bioswales and managing stormwater. But as you'll see in a couple of the pictures, there's a lot of plants in there, and they play an important role as well. At the same time, I'm not a plant person. I'm a kind of a water pollution person. And let's get started. So, oh, and by the way, if you have any questions, I don't know whether I can see the chat. But feel free to ask at any time, and if I'm not responding to it, Matt, if you could let me know if a chat question comes in.
I'll monitor it. It should show up as like a little flashing orange box at the bottom of your screen, but I'll also keep an eye out.
Okay, that usually happens when I'm on 2 screens, but right now I'm kind of crammed onto one so that it looks right to me. But anyway, let's try, give it a try. Here's what we're going to be talking about today. 4 things. One is I'm going to outline the problem a little bit, and it's pretty simple. It's that we have a lot of dirty stormwater, but I'll tell you a little bit about the background of that. And then we're going to be talking about bioswales, and I think once I show you a picture, you'll realize that you've seen them around town. Matt's been building them everywhere, but I want to dig into that a little bit, and then tell you also about what it is that they do. They're not just beautiful gardens, they actually have an important function. And then I'll finish up with the research that I've been doing, which is to try to figure out how well they work. We kind of assume that they work, but it's good to know that for sure and put numbers on it. So the problem, here's images of, on the left you see kind of an undeveloped area, forest. If you have a building, it's got a green roof, and when it rains, water behaves the way that it likes to in forested systems, which is that it filters into the ground. And some of it also evaporates either passively or by the actions of plants up into the sky. And so most of the water is being dealt with through these natural pathways. In a city, you have a system of pipes and catch basins and things. That's called gray infrastructure. I'll show you some more about that later. And the water runs off those hard surfaces, roads, roofs, parking lots, sidewalks, all that stuff, and it goes down into the subsurface where we don't see it anymore, but it's down there. And I'll talk about that in a minute as well. And the outcome is that in a kind of a natural, undeveloped, more rural system, most of the water is getting into the groundwater system and receives natural treatment. I'll bring us to that point too. Whereas in a city, most of it, before we had these bioswales, is going into a series of pipes underground, and then it flows very quickly into the nearest water body, okay? And usually receiving essentially no treatment at all. So we're just taking that dirty water off the streets, and it's going into nearby streams and rivers. And along the way, as it's flowing over these hard surfaces, it picks up all sorts of chemicals that you may not be thinking about very much, but they're there. So people add pesticides and fertilizers to their lawns. Out in the road, they salt, and that's a picture I took this winter. That's a heap of salt there in the middle. It's almost like one of those speed bumps. It was so big. Or in parking lots and gas stations and so forth, things drip off of cars and you get all that oil. And when the rain comes, it washes all of that crud down into the storm drain network and into your nearest favorite stream or pond. That's not good. So you've seen these catch basins all over the city. They don't go nowhere. They go actually to a set of pipes, as I mentioned. And we can't see those pipes, which is intentional, but it's also bad in the sense that it makes us kind of unaware of the problem. We feel water goes into that catch basin and it's gone, but it's not. Indeed, it's flowing to some nearby originally clean water body, and this is picture of a research site of one of my doctoral students a few years ago. I don't know if it's crystal clear, but the water that's coming towards us from upstream underneath that bridge is clear, and then the water coming out of the pipe, out of the storm drain network, is really filthy, and you can just see it. It's that brown mess, and that brown is not just soil dirt particles, it's also carrying a lot of those chemicals that I showed you in the previous slide, so that's not a good thing. And that, believe it or not, that's the best case, okay? So the set of pipes under the city can come in two different varieties. One is so-called separated sewers, and you'll see I have the number 1 there indicating a single pipe. And water from the streets, on the left there, the blue water is flowing into that pipe, and then it's going into the nearby water body, but it's picked up chemicals, so maybe it shouldn't be blue, maybe it should be brown. But then so there's the flow. But then there's this other set of pipes that we have, so that sewage coming from houses, toilets, sinks, washing machines, and so forth, goes to the sewage treatment plant where it gets treated, fortunately. And this is the way that modern cities are built, and the newer parts of the city of New Haven. But older cities and older parts of cities tend to have a single pipe, one big pipe, and it's receiving water. Here, the sun's out, it's dry conditions, there's no rain. And all of the water from the house is going, fortunately, to the sewage treatment plant. However, then it rains. There's the water going to the sewage treatment plant. Then it rains, and the water that comes off the street goes into the catch basin, flows down into that same pipe as the raw sewage. And that mixture of those two things exceeds the capacity of the pipe system and of the sewage treatment plant. And that mixture of raw sewage and street runoff, neither of which is clean, is going into nearby water bodies. And that's the worst possible scenario. In either case, the dirty water from the street can end up in otherwise clean receiving water bodies. And obviously that's something that we don't want. So that's the problem. Let's talk a little bit about what bioswales are, and that gets into a bigger question of so-called green versus gray infrastructure. And infrastructure is just the fancy word for the things that we build, and it can include these pipes and things that I've talked about, but infrastructure also includes bridges and roads and all of that stuff as well. But let's stick with the pipes. So gray infrastructure, and I'm showing you some pictures on the left, is all of this stuff that's underground. All we see is the grates where the water enters, but then you have pipes and chambers, all of this concrete which is expensive. Expensive to buy it, but it's also, you can imagine, very expensive to install because you have to dig up the street, close the street down in order to put this stuff down there. And eventually it wears out and you have to replace it. And as we've seen in the previous slides, it's like the water flowing through this great infrastructure is likely to harm the ecosystem, right? Instead, increasingly, we decided to work with nature with so-called green infrastructure. And instead of concrete, now we have plants and soils and stones and natural materials like that. And the great thing about green infrastructure is it's not only cheaper to install and maintain, but it's also environmentally beneficial, both because it reduces the downstream harm, but looking at the system on the right, it's aesthetically beautiful. It's habitat for frogs and things, I'm sure. It purifies the air, it reduces the local temperature in the summertime, so it has lots of great benefits. You sort of wonder, why didn't we think of this earlier? And here are some of the things. I'll get to bioswales in a second, but here's the brothers and sisters of bioswales, everything from so-called rain gardens, vegetated, it's not supposed to be a whale, it's supposed to be a swale, which carries water instead of like a concrete pipe or a ditch, an infiltration basin, and you can easily imagine playing Frisbee or something on that, or a constructed wetland, which just looks like a pretty pond, but it's actually doing a purification process. And then the hard surfaces, I mentioned green roofs earlier, but you also can have so-called porous pavement, which are a variety of methods to make the surface less hard and allow water to infiltrate and prevent that storm runoff from happening in the first place. And I'm sure if you look around town, you'll see these things. Okay, so let's finally get to the actual bioswales themselves. And this is, I think, the biggest one that we have in town, so it's fun to show it. But when at first glance, it just looks like a kind of a garden that someone's installed in the curb strip of the road, and it certainly is that. It's something that's pretty. So it's just pleasant from that standpoint, but it has an important environmental function that we're going to talk about. When it rains, water runs down the street, enters that curb cut right here. There's also like this little ridge here to keep water from flowing past it. And I'll show you a picture later where you can actually see that thing functions. And you have this green infrastructure. And what we're doing is we're bypassing the gray infrastructure. These things are always situated close to one of these catch basin inlets where the water would go into the pipe. Once we build this, we don't dig the pipes up or anything. They're still there as kind of a backup in case you have exceptionally high flows that exceed the capacity of the bioswales. But so far, monitoring lots of events, that rarely happens. So they're working very well, and I'll give you some details of that a little bit later. Here's a kind of a cross section, because here all you're seeing is what you get when you're walking on the street and you see it at the surface. But there's a lot below ground, as Matt can tell you. They dig down 4 feet. When they're in there, it looks like it's over their heads almost. It's so far down, and then they put in. At the bottom, they put in stone, which has a lot of void space between the stone, so water can sit down there if it needs to. And above that, there's the soil that the plants can grow on. And there's some other details as well, but they're, I think, beyond our need to discuss right here. But the other thing that you see is that this then leads to the natural subsoil. The entire city, even where you see, buildings and roads and so forth, underneath all of that, there's still soil. So water coming down the street gets into the bioswale, it filters down, infiltrates, as we say, and eventually can get into the natural subsoil. And there's a lot of good things that happen down there. I'll show you a list of those in a second. And this is also going from what a bioswale is to what they do. I'm talking a little bit already about the function. So water that's flowed down the street, goes through this curb cut into the bioswale. Some of it can evaporate up into the atmosphere, and some of it can filter down into the soils down below. And the main thing is it's not getting into the gray infrastructure, the pipes and so forth that lead directly to nearby waters that they could be polluting. Here's another image that I think ideas, and you can kind of go through this in order from 1 to 5. But the notion is, again, water running down the street, flows into the bioswale, it passes slowly through the soil, and then if it needs to, it can accumulate in this gravelly part down below. And from both of those locations, it seeps out finally into the soil subsurface. And the thing that we have to be aware of is we tend to focus on the bioswale itself, but once the water gets out of the bioswale, a lot of purification takes place. And the next slide might be overwhelming, but I'm going to show it anyway. Here's what happens, both to some extent in the soils in the bioswale, but also when the water gets out of the bioswale into the natural surrounding soils. And don't worry, we're not going to talk about this in my college level class. We discussed this for at least a week, all of these different processes that take place. But the point is, there's a lot going on, right? There's a lot of physical and biological processes that take all those contaminants that I listed in an earlier slide, and it reduces them so that the water, once it finally slowly reaches a nearby stream or lake, has received a lot of purification. And if you want to ask questions about this later, happy to discuss any of these processes. This is just a picture of kind of a artist's rendition of a cutaway of the soil, and it shows this really interesting zone called the rhizosphere, which is the plant roots in association with fungi, and a lot of interesting biological and chemical processes and reactions take place there. It's really an amazing part of the system that we're really don't think about, but it's very important. Okay, so that brings us to the sort of the final question, which is how well do they work? And so far over the last few years, we've done 3 research projects, one over near Westville and Edgewood Park along West Park Avenue, one up north on the northern edge of the city in the Daisy Gem Street area, and then a bigger project in the downtown area that Matt is still working on. And just to give you a sense of that, this is kind of a blow up of downtown, and you can see the green, these 2 squares right here, and then all of these neighborhoods around it. And what we're looking at are 2 so-called sewer sheds, which are areas of land that drain to a point. And here's essentially the flow path. There's a huge pipe that runs down Elm Street and Chapel Street. They end up down here, and the pipes down here are 7 feet across when you go down to the subsurface and look at them. And all of these little green dots are these bioswales, similar to the one that I showed you a picture of before, a little bit smaller, but essentially the same thing. And water from each of these is connected to, the ordinary flow without the bioswales would be through a series of catch basins and pipes to this central main culvert that would flow to these 2 points. This is the third of the 3 locations, endpoints of these 2 sewer sheds. And the scales of the research varied. In the beginning, we were very modest. We only had 7 bioswales installed in a couple block area. And in that region, you have small pipes. But as I said, downtown, you had these huge pipes. I wish I had had someone in the pipe for scale. 7 feet across. I'm pretty tall, but I can stand erect. And it's impressive when you go down below the street and you see the huge pipes that are down there. It does involve going below the surface, and depending on how claustrophobic you are, this can either be frightening or kind of fun to see what's down there. I go down, but sometimes my students do as well. And here's Kevin and Kelsey, who worked on 2 of those projects and did much of the work. And there's Colleen as well, taking a photo. The methods that we used are, we do 2 kinds of measurements. One is to look at individual bioswales, and here's one kind of in cross section. And we measure water in the street and water at the bottom of the bioswale, and by seeing how much cleaner the water is at the bottom of the bioswale than on the street, we can get a good calculation estimate of the amount of pollution that's being removed. And the only unfortunate thing is we're not able to go into the soils away from the bioswale and measure water quality there, which would be even better because of, remember, the rhizosphere and all of those processes that are taking place. I mean, it's not completely impossible. If we were to sink a well or something, you could do it, but that's actually a very expensive and difficult process, especially in an urban area. So, so far we haven't done that. Maybe something we would do in the future. But again, you see water from the road gets into the bioswale, filters down through the soil and rock, and gets cleaned by natural processes, all for free. No energy goes into this, no chemicals go into this, there's no moving parts. It's really wonderful. And on the water quality side, during storms, we collect series of samples. This is a special kind of sampler with these bottles. We bring those back to the laboratory. We measure them with our expensive equipment. We measure rain and so forth, and we know kind of all the parts of the system. That's for individual systems. We also look, as I mentioned, at the entire, at a much larger scale. And so for trying to understand water quantity, you want to reduce the quantity as well, because that can cause flooding, right? I've been talking mainly about pollution, but there's also a flooding issue here. Then we can compare two kind of neighborhood scale sewer sheds. In this case, a couple of blocks. This is where we installed 7 bioswales, and in addition, there's a thing called a cistern that I won't get into, but it's another kind of green infrastructure. And then we compare that to an adjacent neighborhood, which is very similar in almost all ways, except that it doesn't have any of these green infrastructure implementations in it. And then afterwards, we can say, how does the system behave that has not received any green infrastructure, any bioswales, and how does the other one behave? And that's the couple of slides I'm going to show you next, what they demonstrate. Oh, sorry. I'm doing okay for time, so I'll just mention, for measuring flows, we have a bunch of different methods. We install these things called V-notch weirs down in the sewage pipes. This is raw sewage, pretty yucky stuff. I like it when I don't have to measure that, and I have not been in recent years, but we did it in the past. There's special kinds of flow meters. There's these funny tipping bucket things. We have mini flumes, and we have different methods, all for measuring the water flow. And again, comparing a system which has been treated with bioswales and one which has not. And so here's the results. I'm just going to show you 2 slides. I could show you dozens of these, but I think 2 make 90% of the point. Here we're looking at flow. Okay, reducing flow is good because the flow is dirty, and so every gallon of water that you keep from going directly into a nearby pond or stream, the better it is. But as I said, it can also reduce flooding. And one of the main reasons that the city is interested in this is that downtown area where Matt's been working in the last couple of years, all of that water is flowing over to near the train station. And if you've been out there during a big rainstorm, you'll see that the streets get totally flooded. And so if we can divert that water, get it into the subsurface where it flows very gradually to nearby streams and rivers, it's much better. And this is a very complicated figure, and I have a minute or 2, so let me explain it a little bit. So there's a lot of things plotted. You see these, I don't know if it shows up well on your screen or not, these little gray bars are telling us the amount of rainfall. Okay, so we measure the amount of rain, and what you're seeing is that rain increases, it decreases, there's 2 increases, and when that happens, the amount of flow, which is on this scale over here, also goes up. Okay, so with those devices that I just showed you, we're measuring the amount of water that's flowing, and when the rain increases, the flow in the pipes increases. And what we're doing is we're measuring that control system. Remember, I showed you those 2 neighborhoods. This is the one that I would call this blue. These blue dots are for a system that has no bioswales in it. And then the purple triangles are for a system that does. And before we installed the bioswales, those 2 lines were exactly the same. But after we installed the bioswales, there's this big decrease. At all points in the storm, you have a lot less water flowing in the pipe leaving the treatment watershed than you do in the other one, and that's a big success. And depending on the storm and how you do the counting, it's frequently the vast majority of it. It can be 60, 70, 80% of the water that we're successfully removing from the pipes and instead putting into the deep soil where it gets processed well, purified, and doesn't quickly go and cause flooding at the same time. So that's the amount of flow. Similar results when you look at pollution, so looking at water quality. And here I've picked, we're interested in several, well, we measured several things, including metals and nutrients that cause eutrophic algae bloom, stuff like that. But here's just one slide looking at copper. And the copper, again, the blue dots are the watershed that has no bioswales in it, and the purple dots are the one that does. And the scale
Looks like we might have lost Gabe.
Yeah, it seems like maybe his computer has frozen up. He's still online with us, but we don't hear him at the moment. Let's give him a second here.
Okay. We can see you.
Okay,
But
so
we don't see your slides right now, though.
oh, okay. Let me try to do the, that's annoying. And now?
Yeah, we're just looking at the regular PowerPoint. It's not the same format you had it before, but we can see the slide.
How about that?
That's great.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. So the point I was making is that, sorry, this is the next slide, that under all conditions, you're getting a lot less copper in the treatment system with the bioswales than in the watershed without them. So that's a great success story. As I said, I have a lot more data, but I think that those two slides kind of make the point. And that brings us to essentially the end of the talk and my conclusions, which is that bioswales really do work. And they work whether we're thinking about volume of water and the flow, or whether we're thinking in terms of the pollution. There's some other conclusions that we came to that I don't really want to get involved with. Oh, the one thing I would point out, though, here's that same bioswale with the water flowing down the street and going into the bioswale. And notice that you have this tiny little bump, and water is not really getting past it. There's some other water, but that's, you know, it's not the water that's flowing down the street. So these little bumps really work. It's kind of surprised me when I first saw that. So to finish, I want to thank a bunch of people, including folks at URI, Colleen and Matt, who are on the call. I don't know whether Chris is or not. The students who did a lot of the hard work and went into the subsurface, Kevin and Kelsey, and then folks in the engineering department at New Haven who've been great cooperators, and also the residents of the neighborhoods in New Haven, because I put a lot of equipment out there and it's never been vandalized or harmed in any way. So I appreciate that they are okay with what we're doing. And then just to finish off, you might wonder, you know, here I am climbing down into the sewer. You might wonder, what do I see when I get down there? So I had an artist friend draw a picture, and that's what it looks like. There's a big party going on all the time. And so don't feel bad for the sewer workers, because they really have fun when they get in the subsurface. So if you have any questions, happy to answer them.
Great. Well,
We have a lot. Yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead, Matt. There's a lot in the chat.
thanks, Gabe, for this informative presentation. I'm always re-inspired every time I hear it. I'm ready to go dig another bioswale now. So thanks. As I said earlier, we encourage you to you know, chime in on your mics if you have any questions. We do have a few in the chat that we'll start with. Our first one is from Chris Willems and his students. They ask, you mentioned that green architecture seems so obvious, and yet it took us so long to do this. My students are curious about who or what group, in addition to URI, has been important for getting these designs to cities.
You know, that's a terrific question. There's been a real revolution over the period of time that I've been active. When I was, in school, green infrastructure essentially didn't exist. And civil engineers, who are the professionals who install the pipes and so forth, were just taught how to pour concrete, how to put pipes together, how to do calculations of that sort of thing. And once upon a time, it made sense because indeed, water in cities was a hazard. You know, it would carry pathogens like cholera. It caused severe flooding. And so you want to fix that problem. And initially, we had something that was neither green or gray infrastructure. It was no infrastructure. So water would fall, it would run off, it would run down the streets. It caused all sorts of problems. And you can imagine back when we didn't have cars but horses, there'd be, an incredible amount of horse poop in the streets. And all of that stuff was just, sloshing around and causing lots of trouble. And the immediate solution was to put it in a pipe and carry it away. And why at that time they didn't think about doing it in a green way, I'm not sure. I think they wanted to solve a problem immediately, and the pipe seemed like the best way to do that. How has it come about that we now are moving away from that? And I'll tell you that today, civil engineers are taught about green infrastructure all the time, and the new generations of civil engineers are really into this stuff, like Giovanni's in the city of New Haven, for example. It's been kind of organic, where just like little by little, I can't point to like some big, there's not like, we talk about like big agriculture, right? There's no big green infrastructure. It's just something that has made a lot of sense. People have tried it, and as they've tried it, it works, and so it gets adopted slowly. So I don't think that there's a simple answer to that question. It's just happened across a lot of people, and there's places that have been much more forward thinking about this, and so Philadelphia has a great reputation for pioneering this work. New York has picked it up to a considerable extent. And I'm sure that if you drill down into that, you'd find individuals in both of those cities that had a great responsibility. And I think you'd find folks like, URI that locally in each situation are kind of spearheading the work.
Great. Thanks for that answer, Gabe. Next question from the chat is from Max. He asks, does the decrease in water into the treatment sewer affect the treatment of the sewage in a negative way? In other words, does the sewage plant need a certain amount of water to run well, or do they get enough without the water being diverted via the bioswales?
Certainly, sewage treatment plants are designed to receive some steady flow. And the thing is that all of this green infrastructure is diverting stormwater. And even if we completely saturated the city, all we would do is eliminate the stuff that's running in the streets. The stuff that's coming out of the houses would still be going to the sewage treatment plant. So this will never reduce their flow to zero, or even to a level that would be a problem.
Excellent. Next question is from Barbara. She asks, how well are bioswales doing in winter when most plants are dormant?
Another great question. And the answer is they still do very well for a reason that I think some plant people might be upset to hear me say, which is the plants don't do much of the work. It turns out that they are beautiful. They help with the transpiration for sure during the growing season. But in terms of water purification, they're not a big part of the story. It's a lot more the microbes, the fungi and the bacteria, which live below ground and where it never freezes. The bottoms of these systems, we haven't actually measured the temperature, but I'd be very surprised if the water was frozen 4 feet down. It's not in regular soil, so it's probably not in the bioswales as well. And you know, the plants have another function, and I don't want to trivialize this, but they make the bioswales be something which is beautiful and desirable. And you can put a bioswale, which looks just like a pretty garden, and at some level it is. You can put a bioswale in a location where people would get really upset if you had a big block of concrete, you know, sitting there that might do the same function. And so they're very important politically. Chemically, they're actually less important, and so winter is not a problem.
Great. Well, talking about plants is a great segue to our next couple of questions. We have one from Georgia, and that kind of, and then one from Jen that piggybacks nicely on that. They ask, can you speak about plant selection and any benefits or impacts to trees and other plants in bioswales? And is there consideration of how native the species are to New Haven or the specific area that a bioswale is being built?
Okay, like I said, I'm not a plant person, but I'll tell you the things that I know, and then Colleen or others can maybe jump in on this. But the plant selection is important. You do want things which are beautiful, as I just said, but they also have to be able to withstand both being completely flooded and also being very dry, because both of those situations occur at different times of the week and month and year. I said that plants don't do much of the work. There are people who specialize in something called bioremediation that involves putting in plants that can actually extract toxins. The only problem with that is then the plant gets to be toxic, and what are you going to do? Cut it down and dispose of it in some way, or what? So we're not doing that. We're not picking the plants that are well known to be accumulators of the toxins. And in terms of it being native, that's certainly a good idea, because then they're used to the kind of climate and water availability and so forth that they're going to see here. Not in these bioswales, but in other kinds of green infrastructure. I've seen people spend a lot of money and time planting a variety of species that they feel are optimal, and then without very significant maintenance over the course of a few years, the natives come in anyway, because that's what wants to be there. So that's what I would say about plant selection. Colleen or anyone, do you want to add to that?
I'll just add that as we began working on these, and our first one that we built was in 2013, and now Matt and Chris and the team have built probably close to 140 bioswales across New Haven. We began by looking at experience in other cities about their plant selection, and as Gabe said, they have to withstand flooding and drought, and so it limits your plant palette. But we agree that it's important to plant natives, not only for the reason that Gabe just said, but also for biodiversity in terms of having additional functionality for, say, the insect community or bird community that they would support. So we are looking at natives that can persist. One important decision that we made in terms of the plant selection is, unlike New York City, we are not including any trees in the bioswales. So that is a difference in the design in New Haven, and we made that decision in part because we were concerned that the tree roots over time might affect the infiltration of the water in terms of actually slowing the infiltration. We wanted to make sure there was a lot of, as Gabe was talking about earlier, void space between the stones, and making sure it was very permeable, that the rainwater would be able to quickly flush through the system, which is why we decided that we should not plant trees in the bioswales. I don't know if there's any other kind of thoughts you have to add about the plant choices, Matt.
Only other thing I'll add is that we always try and do a mixture of evergreen and deciduous plants. So as Gabe said, in addition to all the water treatment functionality, the aesthetic aspect is really important. It's a way for people to engage in a very tangible way with water management and green infrastructure. And so making sure that we have a mixture of both small and large plants and evergreen and deciduous plants, make sure that throughout 4 seasons that there's something that will have a presence and have some sort of public interest, and for lack of a better word, aesthetic beauty, because that's an important role that they play as well. And then of course maintenance is really important too. So as we go, we're finding out what maybe collects more leaves or more trash, or what's easier to identify compared to weeds, because not just short-term impact, but also the ease of long-term maintenance is really important to making sure these remain effective. So those are kind of our other main concerns as we're picking plants. Last question I see in the chat is from Georgia. She asks, should bioswales be known as microbioswales? Georgia, maybe you want to elaborate on that question a little bit?
Oh, sure. I meant in the sense Gabe mentioned that much of the functionality of the bioswale is occurring in the microbiome with fungi and bacteria. And it was a little bit of a smiling question, and making sure that the name conveys how this process works. I assumed it was mostly sort of the plant layer and their roots that was doing a lot of the work. But it's really interesting to find out that's really below the surface that's doing the majority of the work that we want bioswales to do. So it's a bit of a cheeky question.
No, Georgia, I really like that question. And at first, when I thought you were saying that the swale was small, but you're talking about the organisms that are small. And
Yes.
I agree completely that we tend to look at the big plants, the charismatic larger things, but so much from the standpoint of water quality and environmental chemistry, so much of it is actually carried out by bacteria and fungi and the microbiology. And it's understandable. I mean, trees also have lots of beneficial, important functions, but we tend to overlook the huge benefits that are provided to us by yeast and fungus and bacteria.
Great. Well, thanks, Gabe, and thanks, Georgia, for that question. I think we probably have time for another question. If anyone has anything to put in the chat or wants to unmute themselves and ask Dr. Benoit directly. Great. Well, if not, again, huge thank you to Gabe. We really appreciate you joining us. Thank you to all of you for tuning in for another webinar. We really appreciate your engagement and all the wonderful questions we got. If you think of any questions after the fact, please feel free to send them to us, and either I can try and do my best to answer them, or we can share them. Gabe, if that's okay, if we share any additional questions with you. And
yeah, I think my email address is up there. Most of us at Yale use a yale.edu, and I have that and check it, but not as frequently as this Gmail account. So if you have any questions, just Gmail me.
excellent.
And I'll just add that next week we'll be joined by Dr. Sergio Estrada from Panama, and he will be talking about biodiversity and bats. So we hope to see you all again next Thursday at 10 a.m.
Great, and Colleen posted it in the chat, but the recording of this webinar and all the webinars we've done are both on the UR website and also on our YouTube page. So if you search Urban Resources Initiative on YouTube, you'll find all of our videos, including the recordings of these webinars.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Enjoy the rest of your
Thanks,
Thursday.
everybody. Bye.